Views and news with Clarence Ford.
Share your perspective.
Only on Cape Talk.
It is 9:36 exactly, and it is Views and News through to half of me, Clarence, and a huge appointment, of course, that we have at 9:30 on a Friday. It does mean Dr. Chris Smith joins us, the Naked Scientist. He's a consultant virologist at Addenbrooke's Hospital. Welcome, Dr. Chris Smith. Great to have you back.
As they say, fastest fingers first. So get dialing now. It's always great to talk to people, isn't it? Because we get often an even better conversation or more insightful questions, and we can also probe for a bit more, can't we? So yes, do please ring up, everybody. We love to actually hear you as well as read your questions out.
Absolutely. And we're going to start off with Keith Heaney's question. Dr. Smith, somebody told me that the rock hyrax, or as we know it, the clip dussie, is the closest relative to the African elephant. How is that even possible?
Well, I'm not sure genetically exactly how related they are, but I know they're in the same lineage. I know that is true. And it's a bit like saying, well, actually, a bat doesn't look anything like a human, but they are much more closely related to us than, say, let's pick a thing like a kangaroo. And you might think, well, a kangaroo looks a lot more like us than a bat does, but actually they're not. We're more closely related. And the reason for this is because of the way that evolution works. When you wind the clock back in evolutionary time, all life on Earth has a common ancestor. In the case of all life on Earth, that's about 4 billion years ago, and it was some kind of single-celled organism, something like a bacterium, which has subsequently evolved over time and spawned all of the life on Earth. And we know that because the genetic code that runs in bacteria is identical to the genetic code that runs in every other living thing. And the only way that could have happened statistically is if we all come from one source and we've all inherited the same genetic code and then evolved by natural selection to become what we are today. So, for instance, you might say, well, are there any other examples of things that look quite different, but in fact are really closely related genetically? And the answer is yes. The closest mammalian relative to a whale, do you know what it is?
Mammalian relative? No, I'm not certain.
A hippo. How do we know this? Well, if you look at the genetic code of a whale, it is very closely related to hippos, but there are certain genetic changes or fingerprint regions in the genome, in fact, where viruses have inserted themselves way back in historical times. And there's viruses inserted in identical places in the genomes of hippos and whales, which show that if you were to wind the clock back far enough, you would find an animal that subsequently gave rise to both a whale and a hippo. So in other words, both are dominated by water or live around water, but they have slowly evolved into their particular niche, given enough time. It's the gentle evolution or change that happens with time because of us becoming better and better fits with the environments we find ourselves in. So we're given a starting point and then we evolve into those things. And the starting point for all mammals would have been about 120 to 150 million years ago. And we've evolved from small creatures that were just about able to run away from dinosaurs into the huge panoply of mammalian life we have today. So it's certainly possible, and genetics bears the argument out.
Let's go to Barris on the line from Bloberg. Welcome, Barris. Go ahead for the Naked Scientist.
I was watching on YouTube about different blood groups, and I see the majority are positive, and obviously you've got a few variants of that. So I'm always curious to know, why is it? I know the basics, but what causes an individual to have a unique blood group? And also, what are the symptoms if you had to have the wrong blood insert in your body? Would you die from it, or you just get very sick from it? And also, I've also noticed animals also have different blood groups. I'm just curious to know why. Why is it blood just blood?
Hi, Barris. Well, blood groups are sugar molecules which are found on the surfaces of our cells. Those sugar molecules are ingredients which are written in our genetic code. And it just so happens that us humans have two sets of markers that we can put on our red blood cells and other cells actually, but the red blood cells are the ones that we transfuse, so those are the ones we worry about. And those markers written into our genes are expressed on the surfaces of our cells, and they give us what we call the blood group. And there's one gene that we refer to as A, and this makes marker A, and if you've got that marker on your blood cells, then you're group A. The other group is group B, and if you have markers that are B-type on your blood cells, you have group B. But because you have two sets of all your chromosomes, then you can have one gene for A from one parent and one gene for B from the other parent, which means you could have group AB, which means you've got both markers on your blood cells. So now we've got 3 blood groups, group A, which are only genes A, group B, which are only the genes that encode B, or a mixture, A and B. And then it gets even more complicated because sometimes people have no markers at all because the genes don't work. So they don't make any of these sugar molecules. They have neither A nor B. So their group, you've guessed it, group O. Now, it gets slightly more complicated because there are other markers, and there's also the rhesus factor, named after the monkeys because of the way they did the studies to work out about what these factors were. But there's other markers. Rhesus happens to have the word or the letter D attached to it. But these are effectively markers on cell surfaces which the immune system can recognise. So if you were to take blood group A people, then their blood cells have markers A and they have antibodies against group B blood because we make antibodies against all the things that are not naturally in our body so that we can defend ourselves against them innately. So if I take a person who's group A and I put group A blood into them, they don't have antibodies against A because that's their own group, so those blood cells are quite happy in that person. But if I take group A blood and I put it into a group B person, the group B person has antibodies against marker A. Therefore, the antibodies would grab onto those cells I put in and clump them together, and you would get an agglutination reaction. That's how we tell blood groups. We do an agglutination reaction. You can do this in the dish and see the blood clump together, but this would happen in all your blood vessels. So we would give this person blood clots all over their body, blocking up their blood vessels and causing all kinds of mischief like heart attacks and strokes and so on. Pulmonary emboli. So that's why it's really important not to mix up blood groups. And if you're a group O person, you have no markers at all on your cells, which means you have antibodies against both group A and group B blood. So a person with group O blood, their cells can be given to anybody, especially if you're O negative. You can give your blood to anybody. You're the universal donor because you have no markers for the immune system to see, and you have just a little bit of antibody, which is not going to matter. It's neither here nor there. So if you're a group O, you're loved by the population because you can give your blood to anybody. But if you're group O, you can only have group O blood because if you put someone else's blood into you, you have antibodies against their markers and that blood will agglutinate. Animals do exactly the same thing, but they have different sugar molecules, different markers, and they don't just have 3 or 4 blood groups. Some animals have 10. Some have even more. It just comes down to the genetics of that particular animal. So it's part of how the immune system works. It's part of how we recognise what's us and what's not us. And in humans, it just happens to have settled on those main histocompatibility markers, group A, group B, and then group O, where you're neither A nor B.
Andre says, I have a question for the naked scientist. Is there really a selfish gene like Richard Dawkins claims? Is there something genetically that limits our altruism? Are we meant to cooperate or compete?
Well, if you think about it, I mean, the arguments that Richard Dawkins was advancing is that we are effectively a bag of genes that exists in order to make more genes and to pass those genes on to more individuals. So our bodies, our human existence is basically a vehicle to convey genetic material, our genetic inheritance. And the body is the simplest way and the least impactful way and the most successful way of passing on genes. That's the point he's making, which is that we don't exist to be nice people. We exist to be a conveyor belt for genes through the generations. And all animals, all things, even bacteria, are the same. So what biology is effectively doing is it is selecting for the genes that are able to be the best able to pass themselves on between the generations. And we optimize ourselves to fit in best with our environment to make sure that our genes go into the next generation. And this means those genes are most likely to survive in the next generation. If you have genes that make you an extremely nice but not very ambitious or not very good at defending yourself individual, then unless you've got lots of other people around you who will be able to look after you, you're going to become someone's lunch. Whereas if you've got genes that make you into an individual that's better defended, more ambitious and voracious about getting food and so on, then you're more likely to survive. So we slowly hone the genes into an equilibrium situation where we're good at fitting into the environment. And if you're in a social species, then you've got to fit in with other people or other individuals, other organisms. But at the same time, you've got to be sufficiently protectionist about yourself in order to make sure that you don't get wiped out and become someone else's lunch. And so that's the whole concept of we are here purely to pass on genetic information. When you reduce it to that, it doesn't have quite the same romance, does it? But basically, we exist and we have sex and we have reproduction in order to make our genetic material flow down through the generations.
And maybe we should cross to this one. The question in reads as follows: Morning, and thank you for having such a knowledgeable person on air. My question is, how many of one sex died before the next sex evolved? Or was it a virgin birth? The chances of both evolving at the same time is impossible.
Well, yeah, interesting point. We were talking about evolution earlier, and I said that life on Earth goes back 4 billion years. We've got chemical evidence pointing to a likely onset of life here on our planet of about 4 billion years ago. So life's been around for a really long time, but for the majority of that time, until roughly about 600, 700 million years ago or thereabouts, it was largely single-celled organisms, bacteria-like things. And then about 500 million to 750 million years ago, life started to get much more complicated, and we ended up with organisms that were metazoans. They got cells in clusters together, and cells began to work in communities. As soon as you get into that sort of situation, you then end up in a situation where actually it begins to benefit you to have as much diversity as possible. And this is where sex comes in. You end up with males and females, or organisms that exchange genetic material to reproduce, and that comes along pretty quickly, we think, in life's tapestry, which argues it must have a major benefit. Because if you just copy yourself, if we were to go around cloning ourselves, we would be like bananas and potatoes, and the story has not ended well for both those species. In the 1850s, the Irish potato famine meant that millions of people starved and died in Ireland because everyone was growing the same species of potato, which are clones. You get a bit of potato, you put that bit of potato in the ground, and it grows a potato plant. You get potatoes from that potato plant and grow more potato plants. They're all genetically identical. And when along comes a fungus-like organism which can attack that particular species, it can attack the entire population and kill them all off because they're all genetically identical, therefore they're all vulnerable in the same way. Bananas clone themselves. They come up from suckers from the roots, and the nice big fat Cavendish yellow bananas that we have today are all clones. And there are diseases, fungi, including one called Panama disease, which attack banana plants and will wipe them out indiscriminately because they're all genetically identical. Whereas if you have plants having sex, when you have sex, you mix your genetic material up. You don't just randomly mix it up. You take combinations of the genes, one from the mum plant and one from the dad plant, or one from the dad human and one from the mum human, and we have pairs of genetic elements. And we can therefore use the fact that we have one of each sort of gene, and they can be different recipes for the same gene, which gives us genetic diversity, and that makes us all different. And if you have that difference cropping up, it makes it much harder for a pathogen to attack you because you are more resilient, both individually and as a population. And therefore, sex has come along quite quickly in our evolutionary time, and we know it came along quite early because if you look at organisms that are quite remote or disparate in the tree of life, you have to go back a long way. They still have males and females. So reptiles, for example, which were around at the time of the dinosaurs were a spin-off of them, what we have today, they had males and females. Mammals came along at roughly the same time as the dinosaurs. They have males and females. Therefore, the ancestors go back hundreds of millions of years to having males and females. And this argues that they were doing that in order to exchange genetic information between individuals during reproduction to give us greater resilience as a population. So this is a very early trait, and it probably evolved in a simpler way, obviously, as a way of exchanging genetic information to get fitness, and became more optimized by life as life evolved. And once a useful working pattern genetically of how cells could mix up and exchange genetic information had evolved, it was then co-opted and used by all the life that came downstream, because it largely works a similar way in pretty much all of the life we see, which reproduces sexually like that.
Okay, we are talking to the naked scientist, Dr. Chris Smith. There's a couple of voice notes that have come through. Let's go there, Joe.
Hi, Clarence and Dr. Chris Smith. It's Jason here. A quick question about sleep. Why is it that sometimes you fall asleep quickly and sometimes you can't? And why is it that sometimes when you're so tired or overtired, you can't sleep? Why is it that sleep is so...
I think that, I don't know if you got the gist of it.
I think he dropped off at the end there. No, I'm only joking. No one falls asleep during this program, of course. But why do we sleep? We don't know. That's the simple answer. We spend a third of our lives doing it, but we have no idea why. But what we do know is if you don't do it, you are less healthy, you're less mentally healthy, you don't live as long, and you also develop many other health problems as a result, mental problems, but also physical health problems. So sleep is really, really important to us. It probably has something to do with restoration and repair. And it also has something to do with self-preservation, because humans, being very visually active animals, we put enormous store on what we see. We are day active. And the best way to keep yourself safe if you're day active and rely on seeing things is not to be out and about when it's dark and you can't see things. So we have evolved to go to sleep when it is dark. Other animals, on the other hand, have evolved to do the opposite, like a mouse gets up when it's dark and it goes to bed when it's light, because it's more likely to become prey for things during the day. But why does sleep happen at all, and why does it happen when it happens? Well, we know that time is very, very important to all biology. All living things know what time of day it is, believe it or not, and that includes bacteria. Even bacteria know the time of day in some respects. Plants can count, do maths, and they know the time of day. They know when the sun's going to rise because they do a lot of their growing at night, and they use the energy they've made during the day to grow as much as possible during the night, not to waste the opportunity. They have to keep track of time to do that. We are no different. We have a clock running in our brains called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which ticks genetically, and it tells every cell in our body via hormones and other signals what time of day it is. That includes the part of the brain that also dictates when we start to feel tired and sleepy, and this helps us to get into a sleep-wake cycle. But the other thing that makes us feel tired, especially if, for instance, you travel intercontinentally across lines of longitude and you get jet lagged, or you pull an all-nighter and you're tired the next day, why, despite the fact that it's now morning, do you still feel tired? Or why, when you go to that really boring lecture, or someone's in a business meeting and they're droning on and on and on, and you really, really struggle to stay awake, and it's one of the most painful and excruciating experiences, why does that happen? Well, there are two things. One is that you have a system in your nervous system called the reticular formation, which sends wake-up signals to your brain. And when you want to go to sleep, it sends fewer wake-up signals, so that makes you drop off. But what makes that happen is that you have in your brain, in the hypothalamus, also a system for measuring how much sleep you haven't had. When we're awake, we accumulate a substance called ADP, which builds up in the brain, and the brain is sensitive to their level. And as they accumulate, they add a tiredness signal. And once they get to a threshold level, they send such a strong signal that it makes us think, I feel really, really tired, really, really sleepy, I have to go to sleep now. And it makes you drop off. What we do to surmount that is, if we're in a panic situation, you obviously wake up, there's a fire, got to get out of the house. Even though you're tired, you get up and act, because you can trump that message by, if you are in danger or if you are excited, that can keep you awake at night as well, which is one of the reasons why Jason say sleep sometimes eludes him. The other thing is if you drink coffee, because if you take a lot of caffeine antagonizes the effect of this and stops the brain seeing the signal that would make you feel tired. And as a result, you feel more awake than you should do, so you effectively feel more enlivened. And that's because your brain is effectively blinded to the sleep signal that's building up in the brain, this purine signal. So the reason you end up with sleep eluding you can be because you're too excited or something stressful's happening, and the brain as self-preservation mechanism keeps you awake, or you don't need that sleep, or because you have drunk a load of caffeine or equivalent molecule that is boosting up the arousal levels in the brain and masking the sleep signals so your brain doesn't see them, so it doesn't feel as tired as it otherwise would.
We are running out of time, but an interesting question from Lana. It reads, my 96-year-old daughter died from internal chicken pox 3 weeks ago. We didn't even know there's such a thing. Please, can you give me more insight into this, as we are absolutely baffled and in complete shock?
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. I mean, obviously, I'm not sure exactly what the manifestation is, and I can only talk very generally because chickenpox can affect people in a range of different ways. There are two ways in which it manifests. It causes acute chickenpox when you get the infection for the first time, and 90% of the human population in countries like South Africa, the UK, America have had chickenpox infection. The other manifestation, because it's a herpes virus, it lives in your nervous system, in this case, for your entire life once you've had it, and it can then periodically reactivate and it comes back. But the return of chickenpox is as the disease shingles, which usually only affects one particular part of the body. But sometimes it can come back internally and it can come back in the brain, and you can get what's called a VZV encephalitis. So it's possible that what happened here was some kind of reactivation that affected part of the vascular system in the brain, or the brain itself, brain tissue that can get infected from your own source of VZV. Sometimes also, and I've seen this, I had a patient who was one of the bone marrow transplant patients we were looking after when I was first doing medicine, and this person, because they had poor immune function, they'd had a bone marrow transplant and were immunosuppressed. The virus came back, but it came back down their intestines, and they had a sore tummy. And they were saying, I just don't feel well, and I've got a really sore tummy. And we put a telescope down and had a look, and they had chickenpox blisters all down through their small intestine. Luckily, we were able to help them with some acyclovir, which is the anti-VZV, varicella zoster virus drug that works very well if you give it promptly. But sometimes people don't realise what's happening, or it's too late and people can't be helped. And I'm very sorry to hear about this particular circumstance.
And it is on that note that we've got to thank you, Dr. Chris Smith, for joining us once again, consultant virologist at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. Dr. Chris Smith, also known as the Naked Scientist, of course, every Friday just after 9:30 news. It is now 2 minutes to 10 o'clock, and orderly Kalinga standing by with Eyewitness News at the top of the hour.